So yes, I'm from London. I grew up there, I was born there, I studied there. My family are from India, from Gujarat. And they came over to the UK in the 60s. And my family are Muslim. Weirdly enough, as I've got older, they've become more and more religious. They weren't particularly religious when I was growing up, but they've become more religious. And so I come from a Muslim background. And when I was growing up, I'm 40 now. When I was growing up, one thing that kids from my background definitely didn't do was want to work in filmmaking. Okay, it just was not the done thing. And but I was always interested in art and photography and kind of just visual medium particularly. And I was asked by a friend to do him a favor. He said, look, I'm meant to be working on something and I can't do it. Can you cover for me? And this was just essentially working on a short film. So he just said, can you just go along to this particular place and just do whatever they need you to do? And I didn't realize what I was doing. And I went along, and all I had to do was carry big, heavy metal boxes in and out of a truck all day long in the rain. And for some reason, I really loved it. It was the most exciting thing I'd ever done, I think. It was a student short film. It was in England, in a forest, and it was pissing or raining. That film, the camera woman on that film said, you were quite helpful. I'm doing another film 2 weeks' time in Cornwall. And I'm from London. My family did never come to India when I was growing up. We hardly left London, really. So I had never been anywhere. But I came from a very multicultural part of North London, very mixed area. So my friends were from all over the world, but we just never went anywhere. We came from a fairly poor background. But before I knew it, this girl said, look, I can't pay you, but I'll give you a train ticket. You can go to Cornwall, work on this film. We'll feed you, we'll put you up, and just do whatever you did on this one. And so I ended up working in the middle of nowhere in the countryside for a few weeks. And that film led to another film, led to another film. And I was about 17 at the time. And that was it. For me, I just ran away with the circus. And so my simple story is that I have never really got a job, never had a proper job. And when I did try to apply for one, I once applied for a job in McDonald's, and they said, what experience do you have? And wouldn't even, that was as far as the meeting got. I said, what do you mean? It's McDonald's. And they were like, no. Right, so okay. So then I realized that I'm not going to really survive getting a proper desk job. Whenever I've had one, I've quit it, because I get bored. I get bored very quickly. So my thing is I like traveling, I like meeting people, I like working with people, and somewhere along the way we make a film. And that film becomes like a record of that period of my life, wherever I've been, whoever I've met, weirdly enough, it's become a job. I find a way, weirdly enough, to help, it pays somehow. But generally, it keeps me interested, It's part of the journey. That's what I love about filmmaking and cinema. And so through films, I've made documentaries. I've made short films, feature films, worked in TV, I've made commercials, I've done bits for radio, fiction films, non-fiction films, bit of everything. I kind of like trying my hands at everything because I get bored. Okay? Any time where I feel like I'm not enjoying myself, I've got to find something else to do. Any time where I'm staying awake at night worrying about the next day or worrying about my job, I've got to get out of that situation. That's one of the things that kind of is a really simple rule for me, is if I have a sleepless night, there's a problem I've got to deal with. So there was a point when I was working in television, just after university, and I had a job. I was being paid to direct network television in England. I had a company car, I had expenses. It was, in theory it was great, but I was so bored. Because essentially all I was doing was just interviewing people every single day, and the interview would be cut down. I'm going to ask you to take a few less pictures, because that's all I'm hearing is click, click, click. That interview would be cut down and it'd be on TV. And I remember thinking, there's nothing here, there's no story, there's nothing particularly interesting, it's just me, it's just a talking head. And I realized that moment in television was a very pivotal part of my career, because since then, everything that I've made, I've tried to stay away from talking heads. And when I say talking heads, if you put your hand up if there's anything I say doesn't make, it's just like, when you just put a camera, you just say, now talk to me. And the person just, or they might be looking slightly off camera to the interviewer, and you ask them a question, so how long have you lived here? And they go, well, I've lived there for 7 years, okay. And what do you do? And for me, that's not filmmaking. For me, that's not cinema. And I've always been interested in making something for the big screen. So I quit my job and I went back to study. And I went back to do a postgraduate. And my graduate film, I made in India, in a desert, in Rajasthan, and with street kids, and none of the people in the film were actors. And I realize now that was like almost the beginning of my interest in this gap somewhere between fiction and non-fiction. Somewhere in the middle is where I'm really interested. You're not quite sure if it's a drama, but it's scripted. but the people may not be actors, or there may be improvisation, or there may be something where they don't even know they're being filmed. You know, there's something in the middle that I'm quite interested in. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a couple of clips, hopefully which will show a bit of the range of work, and then we can just go through some of the process of how they came about. We'll start off with the film that's showing here tomorrow, called Senna. I'm going to ask, has anybody seen Senna? Okay, a few of you have. Has anybody seen anything else? Has anyone seen The Warrior? You've seen The Warrior? Okay. So this is one of my problems in a way, is talking about stuff when you haven't seen it. It's always a weird challenge. So this film's going to show tomorrow afternoon about this time, 3 o'clock. So I'm going to talk about it. There's going to probably be a few spoilers, unfortunately, because I'm going to give away some of the story. But I don't know how else to talk about it without talking about it. So I'll show you the opening, and what the opening does is hopefully set up some of the themes that are to come. So maybe what we'll do is we'll watch it and then we can discuss what is in there. What do you get? Especially if you haven't seen the film, what does it say to you?
I came to Europe for the first time to compete outside Brazil in the World Championship. It was pure driving, pure racing. There wasn't any politics, no money involved either. It was real racing. They just don't understand what it takes from a racing driver, somebody that has left behind thousands of miles away, family and friends, to live in Europe, being so young and always in a fighting way. Nothing ever has come easy.
Chegou o grande momento. Ayrton está pronto para pilotar pela primeira vez um carro de Fórmula 1.
Eu acho que Deus está me dando um presente que eu estou esperando há muito tempo. E Ele está me ajudando muito a ficar calmo, tranquilo, por favor.
Okay, so that's like the first minute and a half, 2 minutes of the film, and the idea in a way is to settle the audience into the world of the story. So there are various themes that are there, which, and stylistically sort of techniques which are there, which hopefully the audience is not aware of, because it's like the titles, you know, this is who made the film, this is who paid for it, is generally what title sequences are. But I quite like using them almost to kind of create the world of the movie. I don't know, you haven't seen the film, what does that tell you? What do you get from it? Any people who know nothing about this movie? Anyone who's never heard of Senna before? A few people? You haven't. So what does that say to you? What do you think that film's going to be about?
I mean, his downfall.
His downfall? Okay, that's interesting.
Because of the line.
Which line?
Through the font, there's like a continuous line.
Right, right.
And it shows some kind of absence or negative space, I think.
Ah, interesting. I quite like that. Anything else? Anyone else? I mean, I'll give you some of the things which are, well, the first people who speak are who? He starts talking, and you see him quite young, and you see him using, the problem is that you can't really tell here technically what we're looking at, but it's Super 8 footage. It's very old kind of home video type footage of him as a kid. This guy, in a lot of the world, is hugely famous. In Europe, in Latin America, in a lot of Asia, this guy is so well known. Now, one of the challenges, and he's a racing driver, okay? That's one of the things. The opening is about him being a kid, driving a kart, and making this journey from being a child to wanting to drive racing cars. He ends up becoming one of the most famous racing car drivers of all time. So the very last shot is him saying for the very first time he's getting into a Formula One car, which is like the kind of top of all kind of racing styles and techniques and formula. And he thanks God. That's one of the things he does. The first thing he says, I thank God for giving me this chance. And that idea of him talking about God becomes a very kind of common theme throughout the film. The film's about this guy who kind of has a dream, who follows his dream, but it's also about his spiritual journey in a way, and what kind of his faith also means to him. The other thing is you have his parents speaking, his mum. And what does his mum say? I don't care what happens, I just want him to be safe. Which is kind of a weird thing to have in a film, but because what he's about to go into is a very dangerous world. Formula One is very, very dangerous. So his mum, just the fact his family are there, I quite like that because it's about him and his family are kind of characters in the story. He's leaving home, essentially, to go off and follow his dream. And he's going into something dangerous. And I just love the fact his mum doesn't want him to just become hugely successful, but she's worrying about whether he's going to be okay, as a parent would. Which, you know, is a bit of what you're talking about in terms of the font. There's a little hint there, which is when someone says, I just want someone to be safe, you're going to go, oh shit, what's going to happen? You know, because that's part of the story, is, well, what is going to happen to him? There are subtitles. His mum speaks in Portuguese. So one of the things very early on is you're saying to the audience, you're going to have to read a bit at a time, okay? This film's about someone from Brazil. And it's about someone who leaves Brazil to go off to search for his dream. And throughout it, that is also a bit of a character in the film, is the country that he's coming from and where he's going to. There's also what you can't really see on this screen in the light is the technical aspect of the whole film is made up of archive material. It's all made up of footage from other sources. So we've got, within what you've just seen, there's a bit of Super 8, there's a bit of footage from Brazilian TV, there's a bit of footage from English TV, there's all these different formats which we've taken, and we spent quite a long time putting the film together. But giving away a bit of the technique of the film before you've seen it, the entire movie is made like that. It's a mosaic. So we're taking a person's life and we're finding little clips from all over the world, from Japan, from Brazil, from France, Italy, Spain, not just picture, but audio, and putting them all together to create the life of someone. And in this particular case, we follow him for a decade. So this is when he first gets into the car, it's 1983, and his Formula One career starts in 1984, and his career lasts 10 years. And the movie is a real person's life, told through footage, and essentially he is the narrator. The idea for the film was, even though it's a documentary, I didn't want it to be a film where I interview lots of people and show them telling you about this guy. Because my background is in fiction, I come from a drama background, in that case I like to show and not tell. I don't like people giving speeches. As I said, I quit my TV job when all I had to do is have people telling me what to think. And so the film has been constructed in a certain way where the whole story, everything you see throughout the film and most of what you hear is bits and pieces of footage we found around the world and put together so that essentially this guy tells you his own life story through his own words. And during his career, he has a main rival. I'm trying to, you know, you guys are all from all different parts of the world, so there's really hard to explain what might be the right reference, but, you know, I'm a bit of a boxing fan, so Muhammad Ali was one of my heroes when I was growing up, and he had a particular kind of rival, you know, Joe Frazier, for example. There were people that didn't like each other, or if you liked tennis, if you're a bit older, you know, there was Bjorn Borg and John McEnroe. There's two different types of athletes, different types of people who have different styles, and those styles said something about their character. And Senna, later on, will have a rival in the film, who's from France, Alain Prost. And these two guys become major rivals, and that rivalry becomes a big part of his journey in his life. That's something we don't hint at here, but that's basically to come later on. By the way, if anyone has welcome everyone that's just come in, by the way. If anyone has any thoughts, any questions that you want to ask as we're going along, please do put your hands up. So I'm going to show you another clip from Senna, and then I'm going to show you some clips from some of the fiction films, and we'll talk about the kind of the challenges and the differences between them. Right, so the next one, we've got it lined up. Yeah, so this is from later on. This is clip number 2. We're skipping forward. And this just tells you a little bit. What I showed you, the first clip was about setting up themes and the look of the film, and also, you know, some of the characters that you're going to come across. What we're going to see now is essentially what this guy is famous for. So I'll show you another clip.
became far more challenging than beating the rest of the field.
That day, I would suddenly realize that I was no longer driving it conscious, and I was in a different dimension for me. The circuit for me was a tunnel, which I was just going, and I realized I was well beyond my conscious understanding.
Multiple seconds into the lead, had the race in hand, with only a handful of laps to go, and he received a radio message that said, "You are so far in the lead, slow down."
Ayrton Senna has hit the wall. Ayrton Senna is out of his car and out of this race.
Ayrton Senna goes out of the lead of the Monaco Grand Prix.
Absolutely, it's proud.
He never wanted to beat me, he wanted to humiliate me. He wanted to show the people that he was much stronger, much better, and that was his weakness.
His post-accident emotion was pure anger with himself, and he couldn't cope with it at all. He actually walked back to his apartment, and it was 2 or 3 hours before he surfaced.
I just came so close to perfection that weekend that I relaxed. I opened windows for mistakes, and I learned that there. And since then, I progressively come back because I lost some confidence at that moment. And then progressively I fight back, and I got much stronger after that instant. Somehow I got closer to God, and that has been very important for me as a man.
I don't know if you can hear clearly what he's saying, but he says, I got much closer to God through that incident. And it's another theme coming back to where we were. So the reason I show you that clip is because that's kind of, if you know who he is, that's what he's famous for driving a car bloody fast, very scarily. And that track is Monaco, which is one of the most famous places, which, now, the funny thing is the opening of the film, I didn't want to show any driving. I remember having lots of conversations with a producer saying, well, he's a racing driver, the first thing you should show is a bit of racing. And I was like, no, what we have to do is do the opposite of that, not show him really racing at all. Because the challenge when you're making a film about a real person's life, someone who's famous, particularly at a sport, and a particular sport which is racing, he has a huge number of fans around the world. But for me, the challenge when making a film like this is, it's got to work for people who can't stand racing. We have to make a film for people who just the worst thing in the world is watching people going round and round in circles for 2 hours, right? That's the challenge, is to make a film for them people. It has to be factually correct. We have to get the story right so the fans will want to see it and watch. But to be honest, Formula One fans are so obsessed that they'll go and see anything if it's got Formula One in it. What you've got to do, though, is get the people who just hate it and who've never seen a race in their life and who know nothing about him. And so that was our challenge, and that was my aim. And the way this film was put together was, it wasn't my idea. There was a producer called James Gay Reese, who had the idea because his father, in the early 80s, worked with Senna. And his father used to come home from work talking about this guy, saying he's never met someone so charismatic, somebody that had this presence and aura around them. And James kind of remembered that and then forgot it because he wasn't really into racing. He was more into football, as am I, to be honest. So it wasn't until kind of mid-90s that he thought, what about that guy that my dad used to talk about? Because he read an article in a newspaper, in the Times of London newspaper, and the journalist was saying, I've met lots of world leaders, I've met lots of very, very famous movie stars, I've met lots of people, but the one person who really stuck with me that I've only met once was Senna. And the language that this journalist used reminded James of what his dad used to say. So that's when James thought, okay, I'd love to try and see if I can make a film about him. Now, James makes drama films. He's made drama before. But he thought, if I do a film about Senna, the only way to do it is to make it as a documentary. because you've got to have the real guy on screen. If you get an actor playing somebody, like I said, I'm a Muhammad Ali fan. If I see a film about Muhammad Ali, I want to see Muhammad Ali. I want to hear Muhammad Ali talking. I don't want Will Smith playing Muhammad Ali. Whoever, you know, Morgan Freeman playing Muhammad Ali, or whatever it may be, right? I don't get the point. So, thank God, James said, we're going to make it as a doc. And he then went about trying to get permission. He then met a writer called Manish, who's born in Shimla, actually, down the road. So, Manish, as he should be, Manish Pandey, he is an absolute obsessive of Senna and Formula One. So he was the writer on the film. Now, this is a funny thing. It's a documentary, but we had a writer on it. And Manish, because he's read every book and seen every race and knows everything about this guy, he was like the library. In the middle of the night, I'd call him up and say, Manish, how are we going to do this? He'd go, oh, let me think. Oh, yeah, you do this. If you look at this race from this particular year, he did this. And it was amazing. It was amazing to just have this knowledge, because I don't have time to watch every race. I don't have time to watch every film, read every book. I like to judge the material that I see, or the interviews that I do. So it was Manish, James, and myself. They then contacted me as somebody who's made fiction films. And our aim was to try and make this film, which is a documentary because it's about a real person using real footage, but to make it as if we were making a fiction film. So we had a producer, a writer, and a director, and every decision, pretty much, we made was as if we were making a drama. The story has a very classic, I don't know if you know, heard of the term 3-act structure, beginning, middle, end. That's basically what it means. But a classical kind of opening, which is setting up the character. That opening scene I show you is like the opening, okay? It's like setting up your main character. Who are the rivals? Who else? You know, what is the politics of this situation? How do you have to achieve what you want to achieve? The middle is a rivalry between him and this guy, Alan Prost, who says he tried to humiliate me. And the ending is one particular weekend, which everything's leading up to, which is like a very famous moment in his life and in the history of Formula One. And essentially, what we did to begin with is Manish wrote a short 10-page document. And that document had all of the ideas of the film in there. There was never a script. And this is one of the key differences, I suppose, between fiction and documentary, is that we didn't have a script. We had a character, we had an idea, we had a 10-page document which said this is what it's about. And then I always kind of go back to my instincts and my history is making short films. So Manish and I sat down and took clips off of YouTube and made a 10-minute short film. And that short film explained what the film was going to be like to money people, to financiers and studio people. So a 10-page document and a 10-minute short film ripped off of YouTube, which had a beginning, middle, and an end, is how we were able to get the film up and running. I don't unfortunately have that short film here, but that became a key part because it had all of the key themes. What I might do now is I might show you another clip, because I suppose my main thing today is, having made fiction and documentary, what I feel now is I'm a director, and I direct everything and anything, okay? And there isn't that much of a difference. I think people like to categorize documentary in one place and fiction in another, and I think it's the same thing. I think it's telling stories. The idea is you find a story that you're passionate about or you're interested in, and your aim is to figure out, how can I best tell this story? Because for me, the aim is to try and engage the audience and hopefully to emotionally grab them. I want to move people. I want them to feel something. I want them at the end to walk away and be thinking about a film, or to have something that they take away. The worst film for me, I know people love them, but there's certain films that I leave the cinema and 5 minutes later I'm like, what did I do today? And I totally forgot, and I spent, in my case, like £12 to see a film, and I'm like, what was that about? You know, I remember nothing of it. I want it to be the opposite. I want films to kind of hit me hard, and I want to be on the floor or crying or something, yeah, or laughing, wherever it may be. So the challenge is to tell stories in such a way that they engage the audience and make them feel something. And if you're lucky enough, you have a character or you have something at the heart of it that grabs people. And in this case, we had a central character who I did not know that much about, but during the story, I'll be honest, Manish, the writer, was obsessed with this guy. And I was a bit of a cynic. I was a bit of the outsider. My job was always to be the kind of the non-fan in the team, and to say, nobody cares, that's not interesting, people are not going to be bothered about it. That's like for the hardcore obsessives, they'd love that. But what we didn't want to do was make a film that would go straight to DVD, or a film that would sit on a DVD counter, you know, in this, you've got all of the films, and then you go, where's a documentary? Oh, it's over there, right? And then within sports documentary is going to be somewhere down, racing documentary is going to be, you know, in the toilet somewhere. So my aim was, how do we take it from there and put it on that shelf there then, when people walk in? So we have to make it work for everyone, and it has to feel like It has to feel like an epic movie. It has to feel like an action film. It has to feel like all those things that people want when they want escapism. That's part of the reason I show you that clip. That's real. There's no CG there. That guy's driving at 200 miles an hour through narrow streets around Monaco. And when you see that on the cinema screen and you see it and you feel it and you hear it, people are quite shocked by it. Even the hardcore non-fan suddenly thinks, bloody hell, now I get it. Because that's the problem. They're used to watching it on TV. And on TV, it's small. And you kind of flick the channel, you turn it off. And our challenge was to take 100% of what you have in our film is television footage, but to try and turn that into cinema, try to make it feel like it's something bigger and something on a more epic scale and more emotional. And funnily enough, the way my instinct was, the way to do that is to stay in the moment all the way through. Not to ever cut out of it to a present contemporary interview, which is, a classic technique of documentaries is you have archive footage, then you interview somebody, and they say, Senna, he was great, he was really fast. And then you show a car going, and then you come back and you go, yeah, and the other thing is he did this. I remember this one time when he did that. And I was like, and what they're doing is essentially telling you the story in a past tense. And they're telling you the story, something that's already happened. And our aim was to treat it like a fiction film. Tell the story in the present. Have your characters, your hero, your kind of antagonist, the guy who runs the sport, the corruption, all these different elements and themes, the family, Brazil, music, all of the things that you would use in a fiction film, but to tell the story in the here and now. So even if you know the story, hopefully you forget where it's going. And if you don't know, you're quite excited by, I don't know where this is taking me, because the twists and turns in his real life story were so amazing that, in a way, we would never have had the imagination to make it up. We would never have had the nerve to write it, because everything that happened in his life seemed to be far more interesting than a fiction script. So I'm going to show you a scene. This is another one which is from a bit later on in the film. And yeah, let's watch it first, and I'm going to ask you guys some questions about it afterwards. Okay. One thing before you play it, can we turn it up a bit?
Question. Yes. We talk about the chicanes and the barriers that we had in Paris. Yes. You happen to hit those times. It's very likely that the times throw you up in the air and you end up rolling. That's what happened with me in Mexico, and that can happen here with other people. I agree that for the moment it's not easy to take it to the top. The president has told me yesterday it was tomorrow. And he has forget. Okay, the president of the visa. Now forget. Now we speak of the photo picture of Mr. Senna. Yes. What we do today, what we do today for the race. For the race, we can do anything. I think it's better to not have those kind of stuff. I happen to lose the breaking point in the first game. Let me finish. Let me finish. And as I went straight, it was blocked to go. I know, and I couldn't turn back. If you move the time, first place, or not a second, or a third, yeah, and that way, there is a rock there. And exactly when you have you must restart on the same place. Because you must respect the distance of the race. I'm sorry that is a regulation. Why is it regulation? Please read the regulation. We got the letter yesterday. Page 3. And the last paragraph you just whatever is the decision, the right decision, you must understand that decision is my decision. I have a feel for that. No, because you don't know what is my decision. It is the best every time decision, my decision. My decision is democratic vote. Only the driver. By hand. I don't know why those. We replace the time by the curve. You have stop, again, abstention, immediately, okay? Immediately, the work, you replace the time by the
favourite scenes in a film, that one. Because it's a scene that I used to show to people while we were making the film. It took us 5 years. I was on the film for 5 years. My producer and writer were on it for about 6 or 7 years. It took a year just to get people to sign contracts and things. In the middle of making this, I went off and made another film. But it's a scene that I used to show to people because they'd say, oh, what are you doing? And I'd say, I'm making this film about this guy called Ayrton Senna. And they go, oh, right, so who's playing him? And I go, well, he's playing himself. And they go, it's a documentary. You go, yeah and no, it is, of course, but it's not. And they go, well, who's narrating it? And they go, well, nobody. Well, who have you interviewed? And I go, well, nobody. There's no kind of interviews on camera. So who's doing a voiceover? You go, well, there isn't one. And so I'd go, just watch it. Just let me show you some of it, and then you'll understand. Because I didn't know how to explain it. Even to documentary filmmakers, it became kind of a weird thing to explain how we were doing it. So that is a room a bit like this, okay, where there's a meeting going on. Now, even if you know nothing about the sport, generally, one of the reasons I like it is it gets a laugh. Even if you don't know what the hell they're talking about, the terminology and the technology and all that sort of stuff, you kind of know what a cone is, I suppose. Funny enough, he keeps the French guy, the guy who runs the sport, Jean-Marie Belest is the boss, who is a kind of a key character in the story when you see it. And weirdly enough, if you look at him, do you think he's a good guy or a bad guy? What do you think? Yeah, what is it about the way he looks? You just know this guy's dodgy, right? Well, he is, and you'll find out. And all the way through, there are arguments between them. And what I love about it is, if that were a fiction film, that's kind of how I want the scene to play. You know, you've got one guy at the back of the room, the naughty schoolboy, Senna, who is the only one who speaks up. He's the only one who has something to say. Now, and the scene makes people laugh. Even if you don't know anything about it, people laugh generally when they see it. And they don't expect a film about a racing driver to be funny. Right? But it was important to make the film have bits of humour, because all of this is character. That is a scene all about setting up a character. And it's about a room full of people who have been told, you know, this is like normally half an hour before a race to have a meeting like this, and a discussion, anything that's important. I've seen loads of these meetings. Nobody ever says anything because they don't want to be there. It's like school kids are like, they have to do the register. They need to say they're present. They sign the form and they go off and they get in a car and they race. And whenever I've seen those meetings, Senna would always have something to argue about. He'd always stand up and say, there's one other thing. And they'd go, oh, God, here he goes again. And he'd always, because that was him. He's a fighter, right? He's an arguer. He's always kind of anti-establishment. The guy on the right behind the desk is the establishment. He runs a sport. He's French. Senna's big rival, who you just see his nose at one point, Alain Prost, is French. He never speaks up in his meetings. But Senna would always say, look, we've got to change this, it's not safe. We've got to change this because it's not good for the drivers. And because he speaks up, it changes. Because by the end of it, everyone agreed with him. But at the beginning, nobody had anything to say. And that's what I love about it. It's about a man who has to stand up for what he believes in. That's what essentially the whole film's about. He has certain beliefs, and even though they're against what everyone else believes in, he will do whatever it takes to stand up for himself, and because he believes he's in the right. And even though it's funny, it's actually about something very important. It's about safety, because for these guys, in the 60s and the 70s, Formula One drivers, there'd be about 20 drivers at the beginning of the season. By the end of the season, over half of them would be dead. That was just normal. Because what they did was so dangerous, they'd have a crash, there'd be no safety, they'd die in their cars, the cars would explode, they'd fall off hills, you know, things would happen. And it was just normal. They just said, well, you know, if you want to be a driver, that's what it's like. And Senna was the guy who would always argue, saying it's not right, this is bad. The other thing is, here's a question for the filmmakers or all of you. How many cameras were in that room for that sequence? One. Anyone else? How many cameras do you think? Two? How many? Two. Anyone else?
Three.
One? Three? Two there? How many do you think? How many? Four? Three? You think one? So what I like about this scene is, this is where when I do a drama, okay, if I were doing that as a drama, how many cameras would I need? If we had a room like this, and we've got a man sitting here, and the Senna's at the back, and you've got a room full of people, and there's windows there, for a start, would you put the camera here facing the windows? You probably wouldn't, because they're all backlit. But essentially, yeah, there is one camera in the room, like that, on the side. That camera person is also doing sound. Nobody's mic'd up. There is no script, and there is no second take. Yet the camera person, who shouldn't even be in the room, but who's just covering the meeting, just in case, no one's ever meant to see this footage. This footage is all behind closed doors. It's like being in a locker room, right? Nobody's supposed to see this. But there's one person filming it, and it's one 40-minute take. At one point, there's a tape change, okay? But essentially, that is all one meeting that lasts 40 minutes. There's one person on the side of the room, but this person is such a good filmmaker, such a good storyteller. They know exactly when to be on a close-up on Senna. They know when to be out on a wide shot. They know when to get a reaction. They know when he says hands up to pull out and get everybody's hands coming up. They know when to get the jokes. Everything that you see, our editors brilliantly taken from 40 minutes and cut it down to about 5 minutes, 6 minutes, that scene is. But it's one shot, one continuous take. The camera's not moved. It's on a zoom lens. And I love it, because if I was doing that as a fiction, how many times would you move the camera if you were doing it as a drama scene? How many times, well, I've got to do here, I've got to do a wide shot, we relight, we go in for a close-up, now we're going to do reverses, everyone leave, relight, the cameraman says, oh, it's going to take an hour, you come around here, you go, oh shit, I forgot that close-up over there, okay, now get the close-up of the bank. And I love the fact this person, he didn't have to, all he had to do was do a wide shot and cover the scene, but instead they can't help themselves, they've got to tell the story. But funnily enough, people who shoot this kind of footage, sports camera people, you know, if you think about people who shoot big feature films for David Fincher or whoever, Scorsese, and you know, they're up here. But the guys that shoot documentaries and the people who shoot sport must be somewhere. But I think that's just the most incredible operating. You know, that is just fantastic storytelling. No director in the room. I've never even met this person. Okay, all we've done is found the tape, and they made a decision to say there is something really powerful here. Let's cut it down. My producers kept pushing me to not have that scene in the film at one point. There's one particular producer said, it's boring, they're just talking, show some bloody racing. And I was saying, but there's only so much races you can show, right? If you're making a film about a racing driver, you can't bore the hell out of people by just showing one race after another. They can already buy that compilation down there, which I was saying, behind so-and-so. You can buy that DVD, particularly in Japan. In Japan, they're so obsessed with him that you can buy, you know, the point of view shot when the camera's in the car with him. For the entire race, you can just buy him going round and round in circles for 85 laps. Just from his point of view, nothing else. And he's quite a bit bestseller out there. So for me, the idea is if you're going to make a film about racing driver, you can't just have racing. You're going to have character and story. So I just love that scene because it's all about him. It's about what he believes in. It's about the rivals. It's about who doesn't speak, which is Alain Prost. The guy never says anything in the meetings, but he's very much present in all of these meetings. And it's about humor, but it's also underneath it, there's something serious, which is about safety. But then there's a technical aspect of how that footage has been gained. This film exists before YouTube, before Twitter, before small, I mean, there were obviously little cameras. You know that shot I showed you in the car? Those cameras were invented for this sport. Because Formula One's got a lot of money and a lot of technology, so they were always creating cameras and things to put in the cars to make it more exciting. And so that little camera, you know, where they're recording the audio is from 1986, 87, 88. Yet technically it still looks quite amazing. And the fact is that footage, if it were not for those cameras, we would never have been able to make the film. But it's also, because this is before public relations and PR and all of that kind of stuff, people are not so aware. Now you've got, you know, all these reality shows. It's very hard to make something like this and have a camera in a room without people being aware that at some point that's going to end up being used. And what I like about it is there's kind of an honesty to the way they speak and the way they act, because they're not performing for the camera. That's never supposed to be seen, that footage. Okay, what we're going to do now is I'm going to just show you another clip from another film, from my first film, which is a fiction film. And I'm going to show you The Warrior, it's called. And it was made here in Rajasthan, and some of it was shot in Manali and around the Himachal area as well. Let's see if we can get, now we're going to need to go to clip number 5. Yeah? Now what this is this scene that I'm about to show you is where the original idea came from. So I'm kind of going backwards a bit now. But I quite like folk tales and fairy tales and classical stories. Okay, if you skip to the beginning of that chapter, you might have to play it. Fortunately, it's quite, you can't see. That's Irfan there, Irfan Khan, but you wouldn't know. Yeah, okay, pause it for a sec. So what, I'll tell you a little about this scene. Actually, no, I'll show it and then I'll tell you how it came about. But what it is there was a footnote in a book of stories that I read with one of my tutors from film school. I studied at the Royal College of Art in London. And we're both fans of Japanese movies. And at one point we thought, why don't we make what's like a samurai film? Don't ask me why. I'd never made a feature or anything like that before. I just thought, let's make a samurai film. And so we wrote one. And we read a footnote in a book. And the footnote was 2 lines. But these 2 lines were really hit me. They were quite powerful, and in a way that became the central idea for the whole movie. And the footnote was a young boy training to be a samurai is shown a severed head and asked, "Is this your father?" And the boy knows it's not his father, but he lies to save his father's life and says, "Yes, it is." And what he does then is he pulls out his dagger and commits suicide. It's like 2 lines in a book. And I remember thinking, I don't know why that really affected me. The fact that it was a kid being asked a question. The fact it's the kid that does something to save his father's life. I remember thinking that and the fact that the kid then dies. The other thing I liked about it is it posed a lot of questions. So why are they after the father? Who's after the father? What has he done wrong? And if that head is not the father, who the hell is it? You know, who's the dead guy? So also what it did do is it kind of set up a set of rules, like a genre almost, because the fact that the kid would then kill himself because whatever his father has done is so bad and brought such dishonor on his name, the family name, the child would then commit suicide. And all of that in 2 lines. So that little footnote, even though there were lots of stories, full stories in this book, that footnote always stayed with me. And so my co-writer Tim and I sat down and tried to expand the idea into a full-length screenplay. And we did. We wrote this 100-page or 90-page script, which was set in Japan originally, but there was no way I could get a film made in Japan at the time. I'd not made any other movies there. I don't speak the language. I'd never been there. So we relocated the script and set it in India. And that's kind of how it happened. And afterwards, it kind of made perfect sense because I'd previously shot a short film here, my graduate film from film school I'd made in Rajasthan with street kids and kind of local people from a village. And it was a fairy tale. And that short film had done quite well. So that's why I had a chance to make a feature. So I'm going to show you the scene, which is actually that particular sequence I was just talking about. And then we can talk a little bit about this.
बाप है ये जवाब दे
Pause. Okay, so when I originally had the kind of thought of that in the script, that scene used to be right at the opening of the film. And then the idea was to go back in time to figure out how we got there. In the film now, it's like half an hour in, that's like the end of the first act is what happens. And the kind of, the story when you open is you see a boy and you see a dad and you think the film's going to be about the boy. And then this thing happens a third of the way through. And then the idea was almost to then shock the audience because you never really expect the child to die. And then it becomes more about the father's journey, because the idea is the father is this warrior, he's this killer, he's a guy who works for the man asking a question, is this your father? Who then has this moment, kind of almost like a spiritual moment, where he decides to walk away from this violent place that he's in. But by walking away, he then loses everything. He loses his son, and he has to go on his journey. And in this case, it goes from the desert to the mountains to kind of find himself. And so what the idea was, I suppose, was to take this Japanese idea, but to try and turn it into something else that hopefully felt in its own way authentic to wherever it's set. And that maybe is something worth talking about for me as a general theme. I live in London, I've lived there all my life, but I very rarely make films in London. I really enjoy going to faraway parts of the world and to find stories that then give me a chance to learn about a place, because I suppose I like being an outsider. Maybe there's something about being Indian, Muslim, born in London, living in the UK, whatever it is, and not particularly growing up thinking I was particularly British, and then coming to India and realizing that people could spot me from a mile away and say, you're not from around here, are you? And you go, okay, so I don't really fit in India. And so I realize now that I'm a Londoner. I'm very much, that's where I'm from, that's where that's where I feel most comfortable. But a lot of the films that I've made are always about outsiders. Senna is about this guy who's, even though he's a very successful Formula 1 driver, he's taking on the system. He's a bit of an outsider. He's this Brazilian guy taking on the Europeans at a European sport. The Warrior is about this guy who decides not to stay in this kind of violent world and then becomes a bit of an outsider. Most of my films have this theme running through them. Not necessarily consciously, but I realize that's something I'm quite interested in. I like Westerns. I like the guy, the baddie, the so-called baddie, and showing their point of view of them. The only thing, in a way, from the original idea that we changed there, you may have noticed, is rather than the boy killing himself, he gets killed. The person who kills, the reason for doing that was because it seemed like a very specific thing to Japanese culture, this idea of committing suicide. It's not although it can happen obviously in India. We decided not to do that because as a story element, it kind of ends that story there. Whereas someone else doing it, and if you've seen the film, that person is a friend of the father at the beginning. He's like an uncle to the boy, who then kills the boy. So then that gives you another question to leave unanswered for later on. And so the idea is to have, a simple thing which then can have lots of layers like an onion that keeps growing. So you set something up, you forget it, and you're going to come back to it somewhere later. So that's the main reason why we changed that beat there. But the film is set in India. It was meant to be kind of feel authentic to kind of this world. But also, throughout it, there are kind of visual elements which, for me, still kind of link back to Japanese films and Japanese stories. So even a village that we found in Manali, or a place called Manikaran, I don't know if anyone's ever been to Manikaran, the architecture looks very Japanese to me, even though it's very typical to them, because it's kind of mountain landscape. So the whole look of the film has this kind of theme underneath it, which is almost like of Japanese movies, because I love them. And so I was always kind of mixing up genre. I've been rambling for a lot. Does anybody have any questions about anything, or any of your own work? Is there anything you want to talk about? Because I can keep talking. Anyone? Go on.
Yeah, I would like to talk about the central idea, because what you said just now was very different from the way I perceived the film.
Which one?
Warrior.
That's why I wanted to say it, because it kind of go, huh? Yeah, well, how did you perceive it then?
Yeah, I felt it to be a guy who has decided to let go. One day he decides to let go of his negative karma.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
Get out of it.
Yeah.
But the moment he decides, to be neutral in his life becomes really difficult.
Yes.
So he has to go through the rest of his life, the rest of the journey of his life, trying to be neutral and adding not even a single negative karma to it.
Right.
And how hard it was for him to move on, and still he moves on. That's how I perceive it.
But you're totally right. No, that's totally right. That is what it is. But it's
what it's about.
Yeah, it is about it. And along the way there are challenges, because he changes and tries to move away from the negative karma, doesn't mean that the rest of the world has changed. And that past follows him and pursues him and gets ahead of him. And
Until the time he absolutely unfolds whatever he has done in the past.
So I mean, you've nailed it. You can explain it much better than I can, because the idea was to have that change in his mind doesn't mean it's that easy in reality. And there's a particular point at the end of the film, the guy that kills the son, he's going to have to meet him at some point, kind of classical storytelling. And what happens then? What happens then if there's somebody else put in that situation? Because the whole idea is this guy's like this tough warrior, but at the moment when he needed to act the most to protect his kid, he was numb. He didn't do anything, and his kid dies in front of him. I remember when I had this script, and I remember going to America for this talk and pitching the idea, and no kind of American studio picks could ever get the idea that a father would just let the son die. And I'm going, but that's kind of the point. At the point when he should have saved him, he couldn't. And they were like, no, he's got to save him. It's like, you crazy? They just couldn't deal with the fact that a movie could be about something like that. But that was the point, exactly, was to make him weak at the point when he should be strong as a parent, and then at the ending have to make a decision when he has like a surrogate child who he's met. What does he do then? And does he let whatever's going to happen, or does he have to break his own vow of non-violence? Because the film's called The Warrior, but it's actually about non-violence.
To be righteous is very difficult for him to even defend a situation in which there is no choice.
So I wanted it to be difficult for him, because people kept saying he shouldn't do it at the end, and he shouldn't, kind of revert back to his past. But I felt that in a way, he has to, because he had to do at that point what was the right thing, which is obviously leads him back into this kind of killing, this awful stuff that he's tried to escape from. No, I mean, I'm glad. It makes it a lot easier if someone's seen the film, because I can just talk forever, but if you haven't seen it, it's hard. What's interesting is that guy, that actor, I don't know if you can see, do you recognize him? I think you may have heard of him now, but at the time he wasn't that particularly well known. Irfan, he at the time was kind of giving up acting when I met him. It was about 13 years ago, 14 years ago, because he wasn't getting really interesting parts. And I didn't really know who he was. Someone showed me he was like a TV guy, and I'd seen some quite bad TV that he had been in. But there was something about him that I just felt a presence. And the scripts that I had written has very little dialogue. Remember I said about working in TV and doing talking heads? Well, one of the things I did, whenever I made films after that, most of my scripts had very little dialogue. The story was told through pictures. And even though it's an 87-minute long film, there's about 7 minutes of talking in it. Most of the film is just told through the images. And so to do that film, I needed somebody who could carry that off, somebody that could act with their eyes, somebody that could do something with very little. And then I got really lucky. I saw a lot of actors, and Irfan walked in a room, I saw his face, I just thought, this guy is going to work, he's going to do it. I had a very good casting director, who's a very big director now, one of the, Tigman Shudulia, who at the time I'd met, and he had done, I think, Monsoon Wedding, some of the casting on that. So I met him and he said, I know the guy, just stop looking, I know who it is, believe me, trust me. And then Irfan walks in, I go, okay, I can stop looking. And once you've cast your film, and you've got your lead actor, you've got somebody that you know you can trust, then you can, then you can look like a good director. If you've miscast your film, no matter how good you are, you're going to have a painful time. I speak from experience, okay? That's really what, you've got to spend loads of time writing your script, getting the script right, getting it all right. Then the whole story becomes about casting. Yeah, go ahead.
In regards to writing the script, with both Senna, you identified the climax or whatever as some weekend.
Yeah.
And in this one, it's like the moment when you have to choose whatever.
Yeah.
Do you start with your climax and then build your script out for both fiction and nonfiction?
That's a good question. Well, I tell you what, with Senna, it was quite pivotal because it's a famous kind of weekend that we're leading up to. Anyone who knows anything will know about that. So what we did with Senna, even though it's a documentary, my references for Senna with the writer were always fiction films. So the one that we used, two films, one of my favorite directors is Martin Scorsese, okay? So the two films of Scorsese's that I would use would be Raging Bull, film about a boxer. How much boxing is in that film? Great sequence, but not that much. It's all about character. It's about a man destroying himself, isn't it? And his journey as a person, and the people around him that he destroys. But I think there are about 7 or 8 fights. And each fight is always about the character. It's always about the one where he thinks he's won and he doesn't win because he gets cheated by the mafia. Or the one where he has to pretend to lose in order to get a chance to fight for the title. And some of them are in colour. Some of them are told in stills. Every fight is different. But every fight says something about him at a particular point in his life. So that was one of the films I used as a reference for the writer, saying, there's 166 races Senna had, let's pick the 7 most important ones. And each one should tell the story about him as a person and move it forward. Goodfellas was the other reference for a decade in the life of a gangster, okay? And the film goes through this guy's life, but then at the ending, what happens? They slow down time. And it all becomes about one day. And he's trying to cook the pasta sauce, and he's got to do this, and he's got to get the drugs, and he's got to get rid of the guns, and he's taking lots and lots of drugs. And suddenly you start seeing, instead of years, you start seeing time and days. You start thinking, well, obviously something's going to happen, because just the audience, that suddenly they're getting very specific. So what we do in Senna is we start the film when he's young in 1984. Then you go to 1985, 1986, 1987. And we get to a particular year where suddenly we go Friday. And even if you know nothing, you go, oh shit. You know, why are you going Friday? You know, what happened on Friday? And it's basically, that's what happens. The tension suddenly changes because we're getting very specific. We're not talking about a year. We're talking about a particular day on a particular race on a particular weekend. And it becomes Friday, Saturday, Sunday. And even that is like a classic rule of thirds. You know, the whole thing of you set things up once, twice, and the third one is a payoff, but with a twist. That's kind of classic storytelling. One of the things that's interesting is to try and... Oh, it's always good to know what the rules are. You can always break them, but it's always good to know them because it's not a bad thing to stick to some of those rules. You know, people expect things in a certain order. So that idea of having Friday, Saturday, Sunday, it could have been Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. It becomes one day too many for me. I'm a big fan of the rule of thirds. So that idea, with Senna, we knew what the ending was going to be. And we knew the ending was going to be a major act. That's the last 20 minutes of the film, that weekend. Then you have the middle was always going to be this rivalry. Funnily enough, with Senna, the hardest thing was where do we start the film? With that one, we couldn't figure out where to begin it. We had every cut we had would have a different opening. And the version that I showed you, which had him as a young kid with the Super 8 riding in a go-kart, that happened really late. Now it seems really obvious. If you see the whole film or anyone's seen it, it seems really obvious to start with him as a kid in a go-kart. But it took us 2 years to get to that point. We had all of these different endings. One of them opened with the ending, which when you see the film, you'll understand. And we decided not to do that really late in the day. And then it just seemed so obvious to go to him as a kid. And that kind of idea pays off later on in the film. With The Warrior, we knew the opening. I knew that scene. I knew that there was a question which is about him wanting to go on a journey, but I didn't really know how I was going to pay it off. And actually, the act when he meets when he meets the killer of his son, isn't necessarily the climax. That's one climax, but there's another kind of emotional journey that he's still going on. And because I didn't want it to end with revenge. I didn't want it to end with him killing someone. That's kind of an ending, but really it's also about his relationship with his boy that he meets along the way and what happens between them. So it was an interesting one. Each idea, each story, sometimes you have the opening, sometimes you have the ending, and you have to, I suppose, using the rules that you've set up, try and figure out how to tell the story best, hopefully. Any other questions from anyone? Yeah.
You mentioned at the beginning that your storytelling lies somewhere between fiction and non-fiction. That was pretty clear with Senna. But what was the element of non-fiction in The Warrior?
Well, it's not non-fiction necessarily, but what happened in the film before that was my student film had non-actors. And the thing is, I was a student in London, and I came over and I looked around and I went to the Pune Film Institute and I saw all of the films, and there was one film that I really liked. So I went to the director and said, I need you to help me. I'm making a film here, but I don't know how it works in India. Can you kind of... And so this guy worked with me. And in the end, I wanted to make the film with non-actors. There's this... I go sideways a little bit. Do you know Ken Loach? Do you know the filmmaker Ken Loach? But before I came to make that student film, I managed to get him on a phone. And I said, because he's made lots of actors non-professional actors, non-actors. And I wanted to know, how do I do it? How do I work in India? How do I make... I've got this crazy idea to make a film there, but I don't really speak the language very well. I don't know that... I've lied to my college and said my family are really well connected, but they're not at all, just to get the equipment out of the country. Then I've got to get government permission, and I've got to get the script cleared by the ministry and all this stuff, and I'm going to have a government official standing next to me when I'm shooting, all the way through the shoot. But I'm working with non-actors, and when I did get to India, I realized that all of the people I was meeting to be in the film couldn't read. So here I am with this script that I spent months writing, and everyone I meet is illiterate, okay? That I want to be in the film. So nobody ever read the script. The script was there to get me the money, got me the equipment, got me on a plane, and once we were here, nobody ever read it, apart from me. And then I would work with the kids, and I would say, this is what you're going to do today. And we tried to shoot the film chronologically. This is all you have to worry about. Don't worry about your character development in 3 weeks' time or whatever. Just this is what you're going to do. This is how I've written it. How would you do it? And that became the process. I would say to the kids, how would you do this? And they always came up with a much better way than I had written in North London. So then the idea was to take the camera, never stick it in anyone's face. It was always quite far away, on a long lens. Sometimes 2 cameras. There was no one yelling action. There's no one saying roll sound. The kids had to get on with it. They would do their thing, and we'd shoot it without them even knowing. And animals would come through, and people would be walking past in the village, and that became the process of I didn't know it at the time, but it was essentially we were putting people in situations in real villages. We had sets, but they were always real locations adapted. It was never go and build something in the middle of nowhere. You know, one of the notes that Ken Loach gave me was, change your script to fit the location. Don't change the location to fit your script. Don't waste, if your film ends with this brilliant sequence in a church, and you're out somewhere in location, and you see this beautiful tree, that's where the scene takes place. The tree is much more beautiful for me somewhere in Rajasthan than trying to build a bloody church, you know. So the idea is how you cleverly use your money to get you out there on location. Have lots of film, shoot your rehearsals, shoot everything, okay? Don't suddenly get precious about footage when you've gone all that way to shoot. So we'd shoot a rehearsal, and invariably the rehearsal would be better than a take. So always shoot a rehearsal, particularly if you're working with children, animals, fire, anything like that, shoot it. Because you'll never know, and the kids get bored so quickly. So you had this little kid, Jiggly, who's just nuts, okay? He's going to do 2 takes and then he's going to just flop. I have kids now, I understand. So that was, you know, a lot of it was this idea of putting them in a situation, but actually not really. There was one kid, there were 3 kids in the film. A young kid, an older kid who was a pickpocket. We met him, he was traveling around with 2 other older guys, and they traveled on trains, and they were pickpockets. For a couple of weeks, he took a couple of weeks off, hung around with us, had this amazing experience working on a film and having, you know, these girls doing his hair and his makeup, and it was an amazing experience for him. This is before email and stuff, so I lost contact with him, and I learned a lot from that, because we weren't able to stay in touch. In The Warrior, we went to the Salam Balak school that Miranair set up, and one of the main kids came from this school where set up for kids that live on train station platforms. And Noor, who was in The Warrior, who I might show you a scene of his later on. I think he was about 14, 15 when he worked on our film, and he'd come from this school, and I met lots of young kids, and he was the most impressive one. He's now made feature films. You know, this street kid has now directed features. He's worked with Shah Rukh Khan in movies. It's an amazing journey. He emails me, this is my YouTube link for my latest film, you know. It's incredible what can happen, you know. So anyway, the Sheep People is the one where I was kind of treating it almost like documentary footage at times, and putting people in situations that I was manipulating, but not necessarily always controlling. And I think that's my point. Documentaries have always used techniques of fiction, and fiction have always used techniques of documentary. There isn't this total separate kind of idea. You know, it's the same thing. You're editing, you're telling a story, you're trying to make the audience feel something by editing. You're trying to take things, and the idea that documentary is untouched and unaffected is not really true. You know, everything has been changed, everything has been affected. People do get people to do takes again. They do say that didn't happen on camera, can you just do it again? There are, I'm sure, lots of filmmakers that don't do any of that, but a lot of them do. A lot of people kind of script things. You know, this is what I need. This would really help if you just said something like this. And it's the same thing. It's the same thing. So with The Warrior, we had a mixture of professional actors like Irfan and non-actors, again, some of whom couldn't read. But it was much more of a drama, much more of a classical kind of drama, because it's a feature. It's longer, there's a lot more pressure, there's a lot more money involved, there's a lot of executives and people like that I have to keep happy that are looking at the dailies and things like that and the rushes before I see them. But what was interesting on that one, being my first long film, it was a very long shoot. It was 3 months of filming in the desert in Rajasthan and in Himachal, and the equipment kept blowing up. So in that film, what was interesting was the whole process of when you're making a film, to just trust your instincts. You know, we were shooting on film. There was no playback. There was a playback machine, but it kept exploding. So we just said, okay, sod it. Just worry about what you're doing today. Don't worry about what you shot yesterday. Don't worry, just worry about tomorrow and worry about today, and try and get through each day. Because The Sheep Thief, we were filming for like 12 days, spread over 3 weeks, and it was quite an expensive short film. It cost £25,000. The next film I made was The Warrior, which was filming for 11 weeks, 6-day weeks in the desert, and it cost £2.5 million. It was a big leap. There was a lot of pressure, and I used the same crew, the same people I made my student films with were the crew on this film. But it was really interesting. The student film was like a group of friends making a film. When you make a feature, there's a lot more pressure. Very lonely. You look around and you go, everyone's got a little gang. The camera crew are there, the sound crew, production design crew, the producer's got a huge crew. And it's just me sitting there with this script, hopefully figuring out what I know, what I want to say. And what I remember was on the first day of shooting that, I'd spent 2 years, 3 years trying to get the film made. I hadn't directed anything for years. So I remember standing there, and the first question from the assistant cameraman was, what lens do you want? And honestly, I hadn't made a film for so long, I'd forgotten everything. So I totally had forgotten how to direct, and I just thought, I can't remember even what numbers lenses are anymore, you know? And then I thought, I have never shot on 35mm, so I don't know. I've only ever shot on 16mm. And it was like I just felt like there were 200 people on that crew as well. It was a big crew. Everybody's looking, saying, this guy doesn't know what the hell he's doing, does he? And I was like going, I don't know what I'm doing. So then I kind of made up something and we shot it. And I look at that opening scene, it's still near the beginning of the film, and it totally looks different to me, to the rest of the film, because I hadn't actually figured out what I liked. I'd forgotten what I'd liked. It'd been like a classic thing where I called myself a director, but I hadn't made a film for so long, I'd forgotten how to direct. Luckily, with a long film, you have a long time to shoot. You have time to get back into the act of and the process of being a filmmaker. And if something does go wrong, you can always reshoot it. Much harder on a short film, much harder on small format films, because you only have a certain number of days. Something goes wrong, that's it. With a feature, you can always pick something up. You always reshoot. And more what I do now with Senna and with films that I've made since. I did a film for the Olympics recently in London. And with what I do now is I basically start the film almost by editing. I just see what I can find archive-wise or footage on the internet. I go off and shoot something and I start editing first, and then I start writing. And then the writing, the editing, and the shooting all happens at the same time. Rather than a classical write a script, spend years working on it, then get the money, shoot, and then cut. I really like the process of all of them happening at the same time, because one thing affects the other. And that comes more from the kind of non-fiction, that comes more from documentary, I guess, where you can get something and you can just go out and shoot. And that's the bit I love about documentary, whereas with drama, you can spend years talking. Talk. And then you forget why you want to make the film and who you are and why do I do this. And the great thing with documentaries is that it can be just you and one other person, or just you go out with a camera, shoot something, cut it, and you go, look, this is what I mean. And I do like that thing of being able to show people something. Go ahead, yeah.
So, anyway, in short, my question is, how do you really arrive at the center point of the story?
How do you find a center point of the story?
The soul of what you're doing. Because I believe, personally speaking again, that that's probably the biggest challenge in making a documentary.
I guess, I mean, it's a good question.
In so many different ways.
Yeah, of course.
You yourself said that there were so many beginnings.
Yeah.
So many ways you work on it.
I think first of all, I guess, well, one thing that I would say now, having made a few films, is I'm not necessarily afraid of saying, I don't know. Because at the beginning, when someone says, what lens? I could have an answer, haven't I? Or else I look like an idiot. And now I'm like, I don't know, put one on, show me, and then I'll tell you if it's wrong. Because that's now how I work. Now I'm like, give me something, and I'll tell you if I work from a process of elimination. Give me the options. If a designer says, what sari do you want, or what shoes do you want, or what knife do you want, well, what have you got? That's wrong, well, that's the only one we've got, we have to use that one. Or something like that, but with more of this or less of this. So in terms of this, there must be a reason why you wanted to make that film. And part of the challenge when you make a film is to think, try and keep that moment of saying, I wanted to make this film about this blind school because of this. And that has to be the heart of it, is that's the reason why you even sit there in bed at night or wherever you are going, I've got to make this. There's a reason I want to make this. What the heart of it is, I don't think you have to know at the beginning, because you don't know what exists. If you think of it as a process of elimination, you have to go out there, shoot something, meet people, talk to people, and then figure out, well, what's the most interesting person? It's a bit like casting on a fiction film. I don't like having an actor in mind before I start casting, because I'm never going to find that type. Even when I write a script, I know that if I describe them in the script a certain way, it doesn't mean I'm looking for that guy. Because I may have written a tall, good-looking guy, and then this guy who's a bit big and short comes in, and they're much better. That's who it's about. So I would guess that the idea is to have something that gives you that little thing that you're going to keep hold of, which is why I want to do it, why it's important to you. But how you do it, you have to find out on the process. And it's got to be a process of this journey that you have to go on making the film. And somewhere along the way, you have to meet the right person that you think that's the center. And you obviously don't even know they exist yet because you haven't started on it. The main thing is to start on the journey and doing research. And that's one of the things that I've always liked doing, whether it's fiction or documentary, a lot of it is doing your homework and getting out there and going to somewhere and spending time there and meeting people and talking to people. Personally, I don't like putting things too quickly on tape or camera or recording them, because it can, normally the first time you do it, it's probably going to be the best. You might be able to get someone who's quite experienced to do it again and again, but generally the way they tell it to you the first time, and you don't want to use it up. You don't want it to be used up before you're recording it, but also you don't want to intimidate them with a camera And there are other filmmakers here during this week that you can talk to that are more experienced at shooting documentary stuff. But I, with Senna, didn't put a camera in front of anyone's face. Is that my battery gone or something? Yeah. I didn't want to put a camera in front of people because they're all very, very experienced people in Senna. They've all been interviewed hundreds of times. So I thought, what am I going to get out of them that I haven't already said? Also, I don't really know that much about the sport yet. So I don't want to be standing in front of them, interviewing them and looking ignorant. So I needed time to gain their trust. So a lot of it is just spending time, in my case with Senna, looking at all of the material. For nearly 9 months, all we did was look at the footage. And I started editing it. We were not green-lit, so we didn't have an editor. I couldn't hire an editor. So I had an edit suite, and I started cutting it. And I started assembling the film. And during that process, that's when the film came out. So I only figure out how I'm going to direct a film by starting to make the film. I guess is my long-winded answer. That's what I'm saying. You've got to start making it. And then you'll go, this doesn't feel right, but this does feel right.
I think the key is to just
get out and do it. I think that's the most important thing about filmmaking is don't talk about it too much, but get out and do it. And try and finish what you've started. Whatever it is you do, try and complete it. The saddest thing is people with great ideas that never complete them, that are somewhere on a shelf or somewhere still on that damn. That's the danger for me, video and non-linear is that you can just shoot hours and hours of material, whereas I started off shooting on film. So you'd have to think before you shot, because it's bloody expensive. So before you turn on the camera, because you're burning money. So you go, all right, well, what am I filming? Why am I filming? Why am I doing this shot? What is the point of it? And what am I going to cut it with? And all of that process happened before we turned on the camera rather than after. So part of it is to plan it.
Yeah, the other one was a very interesting example of how a regular feature film uses documentary kind of footage, which is Good Night and Good Luck. If you're talking about a combination of
yeah.
film can be...
They do it all the time now. We just don't notice it. The Queen was this big hit, which Stephen Frears did, which had lots of footage of real people around the time that Diana died, used with, and they're mixing them all the time. People do it all the time, and it's just like, you don't notice it. And I think docs do the same thing. There's a great film that I saw in England recently called The Imposter. Has anyone seen The Imposter? Have you seen it yet? Oh, it's fantastic. Have you seen it? Amazing. I don't know what it is. I don't know what the genre is, but it's fantastic. I think they call it a documentary, but I don't know if it is. But it's absolutely brilliant. And you're sitting there going, it's a thriller. It's, really, the genre should be like, is it an action film? Is it a thriller? Is it a comedy? Because that's what it is. It is brilliant. If you get a chance to see it, you must see it. You've got to try and get a hold of that as well. Did you have a question?
I did, yes. We sort of answered it in that last about. I know that you won the BAFTA for editing, and I sort of saw you as being a director-editor, and I was just interested in your directorial decisions in Senna. I won't spoil it, but
no, it's an interesting question. Yeah.
Okay.
Well, I tell you, the thing was, okay. So when making the film, I became very aware early on that there's a lot of material out there. There is thousands of hours that we've seen. We've probably looked at about 15,000 hours of material on Senna. We had about 10,000 on our Avids, and they kept exploding. Wherever post-production facility we were using, they ran out of memory because we were using it all up with our brushes. And I just thought, okay, because there's so much material, because he's a very strong presence on screen, the story has to be told by him. He has to be the lead character, not other people's opinions of him. So we've got to keep looking. Normally, if you have a gap, you have this bit of footage, and you have a gap, and you have this bit of footage. Classically, you go out, you interview someone to plug that gap. And you get someone to say, well, the thing is, in 1984, this happened. You go, right, great, he's dealt with that issue, we can move on. And I would be like, no, we're not going to do that. Because we're going to try and tell the story entirely out of footage, we've got to find something that fills that empty space. If we can't find it, we rewrite the script. And that's what we would do. We'd change the story to say, well, what can we find? Oh, we found this. So instead of going this way, we're going to go that way, and then come here. And that's where the editor would be editing, I'd be interviewing people, I'd be editing, and the writer would be rewriting the script constantly. And what happened was I said, okay, if we do the film this way, by not interviewing people on camera, I'm essentially taking myself out of the film. That was a conscious decision to say, people are going to say, well, what the hell has a director done? Okay, because a director hasn't shot any of the footage in the film. The audio I've shot, but you're not aware of it when you're watching it, whether or not it's archive audio or new audio. That's the idea. You're not really meant to know. And so I just thought, if it's the right way to tell the story, that's why we're going to do it this way. Even though it will look like, and honestly, there were points during the process of making the film, I'm pretty sure people upstairs were saying, why do we need this guy then? We keep telling him to go out to shoot interviews. He doesn't come back with them. Or I'd come back with them on audio, and then they say, you have to shoot the interviews. So then I'd go out with a camera. Accidentally, the mic would fall in shot, ruining the shots. I couldn't use a shot. And they'd get more and more wound up by my weird, bad techniques of not shoot. If you shoot the footage, you're going to get forced to use it. I'm a big Hitchcock fan, okay? Hitchcock would not shoot coverage. His rule was if you shoot coverage, the studios will make you use it. Because classically, when he made films, you do a wide shot, then you do a long shot, then you do a medium long shot, then you do da-da-da-da-da, and then you turn around, you do everything the same, so you cover everything from every angle, and then they say, okay, now we want to see our movie, our actress. We spent all that money, get her. And he'd say, well, I haven't shot it. Because the film's been constructed and storyboarded in such a way that that's not the point when you show her. You show her at this point, you know. And they'd say, well, where's the shot? And Hitchcock would say, I haven't shot it. And because he was Hitchcock, he would find a way, because he was a great filmmaker. So for me, that is the way to learn about filmmaking. Design your film before you go out and shoot it. Think about what you're trying to say. Think about what the point is, and then shoot it. Don't just shoot everything from every angle and then get in the edit and go, I've got no idea what to do with all this material. So in my case was I shot, didn't shoot the interviews. Eventually I did, and they end up on a DVD. But the idea was to do it in such a way where I'm not in the film and distracting people. But the downside is that people look at it and say, well, there was no directing.
Well, I would say there is. And what really struck to me, I've seen it for a couple of years now, is your incredible pulling the focus onto Ayrton Senna's eyes.
Right.
You do it all the time, and I was quite because you're letterboxed by his helmet.
Yeah.
That's what remains after.
That's the windows to the soul, isn't it? I mean, it's kind of funny you mentioned that, because that's the poster for Senna in the UK and around the world. And it's one of the things, right, going back to The Warrior, one of the reasons why I cast Irfan was because of his eyes. Right? It was like, literally, if you have somebody who has this presence with the eyes who capture you, and Senna's got watery eyes, he's kind of always on the verge of crying, I would say. He's very emotional. And there's something about him that always looks like he's so passionate, whether it's through anger or passion or emotion, he's always about to cry. And it's really interesting. That became a key thing which the marketing people saw, and that's why the image became just his eyes.
But you were pulling the focus on.
I refer you to the DVD available on Amazon. No. Yeah, you're right.
But you were putting the focus as a director onto his eyes.
Well, I was picking shots at certain points, exactly. The construction of how to tell the story was when do we show his face, and yeah, there were things we were doing, because it's TV footage which is square, and our film was released widescreen, so you have to crop it, and as soon as you crop it, you're going tighter on the eyes. So there was a lot of that was reframing the footage, which worked in most of the cases. When it doesn't work is when you see the shots inside of the car, because then the squareness really helps, because you've got the road, you've got him driving, and also you realise that this is such an old car. This is when they used to have manual gearboxes. So he's driving one-handed, which now it's all electronic. It's all up there. They never take their hands off the steering wheel. So that was one of the things we ended up losing. Any other questions from anyone? Yeah. That's all right.
Documentaries are becoming very important from the box office point of view also. So can you speak a little bit?
Yeah.
Can you tell us something about the commercial aspects of making documentaries?
Yeah, this is an important one, actually.
Making a lot of money now.
It's our film.
Almost mainstream.
Yeah, it's really interesting that it's about box office and documentaries, and I think what was interesting was because we had this intention, like I said, to not make a film that was going to be a niche film. We specifically wanted to make something that would try and cross over. We knew, you know, Senna's, that final race that I talked about was watched by about 300 million people around the world, live. Okay, and there are a lot of people that watch Formula One now. It's obviously now come to India. Wherever, if there's money somewhere, then they're going to be there, okay? So we thought there was potentially a market for this film. Now, one of the things the producer did do, this isn't an independent film. This film was made by Universal and working title with a production company. And in a way, the producer had a good idea to aim there. Why? Because the people who own these big companies drive very nice cars. And generally, Formula One is the sport of the really rich people. So the guy from Working Title has a lot of Ferraris, okay? He knows who these people are. They've tried to make dramas about Formula One and never managed to get them off the ground. So then the idea of doing it as a documentary seemed like the only way they could get in that world. Funnily enough, they've just made a film now called Rush, which Ron Howard's just made after our film. Now every studio is going to have a Formula One film out because this film ended up doing really well. And commercially, it's kind of the most successful British doc ever. It's ahead of March of the Penguins in the UK. It's only behind Fahrenheit 9/11. And it did really well in Australia, really well in Russia, really well in America, really well in Canada. It basically crossed over around the world on theatrical, on DVD, on Netflix, all of that stuff. Because it's a studio film, hardly any of it will come to the filmmakers, but it's like, you know, we got to make the film we wanted to make. We're very happy. I'm very proud of it. But it became something that kind of changed a bit of the rules in a lot of places. And a lot of Universal then decided to make the Bob Marley film and release that. And basically, they asked me to do another film about another musician, which I may or may not do. But it's interesting now they're seeing there's a market. And there was one of the filmmakers I was talking to yesterday who said his film was picked up by Focus. Which Focus haven't released, I think, a documentary before, as far as I know. But they're now realizing, because I suppose one of the things is a bit of money to be made, but it's a bit of a kudos. There's something slightly that balances out the big studio, shallow, you know, visual effects heavy films that they're famous for, and something else that's kind of maybe more emotional, more powerful. Excuse me?
It's extremely low risk.
Yeah, but you know what? They're most studios are not interested in low risk, they want money, all right? It's really simple. They've got one box office. So they're only probably going to want to be involved in films that they think they can make money out of, if there's a market there. I think that's probably the reason they're getting involved. And there's a kudos element of, you know, if you can get to the Oscars and win an Oscar. Because last year, you know, Harvey Weinstein won with Undefeated, the American football film. So, you know, studio heads now want to win as many Oscars as possible. If you're giving up the chance of, you know, they want the best film, they want foreign language film, and they want documentaries. I think there's a lot of stuff like that that they're getting more and more involved in. But I think there's just something amazing happening in documentaries. And partly, as fans of cinema, they can't, wherever you are an executive, if you look at a really good documentary, you look at a lot of the fiction films being made, documentaries win over every time, if you ask me. They're just far more interesting, more powerful, and more emotional. And the way the stories are being told, they hit home more. So maybe there's an element they're just saying, why are we ignoring that? Anyone else? Yeah.
Yes, you told us not to give up our good ideas and to go at the end of that, but how do you really feel that you have a good idea? How do you...
I suppose, you know, a part of being a filmmaker is just trusting yourself. You just have to, don't worry about what the rest of the world is doing, don't worry about what everyone else thinks, but just find something that you're passionate about. And if you're passionate about it and you feel there's something there, and like I said, if it keeps you up at night, then that's good enough for me. That's all it has to be, because you're the one that's going to have to put in the work. So it's just got to be something that you feel is important. And I would say original is another way of looking at it. I think part of the challenge when I was at film school was, you know, my tutors would say to me, make a film that's going to make a mark so you'll get a job in the industry. So I said, well, I've got this idea and I want to make a film in a desert in India. And they were like, nobody wants to see that. That's the worst idea in the world, okay? And generally, I've always wanted to do that. Every film was about setting myself some sort of impossible task. Something that I have no idea how I'm going to do it, but the journey to get it made will be the fun thing. And the journey is part of the fun. And, you know, so I can show you a clip in a minute from a film I did in the Arctic, which is this mad film where we lived on a Russian icebreaker in the Arctic Circle in this island with polar bears, and we had an armed guard in case we got attacked by polar bears. Like, why the hell we did that, I have no idea. But I went to this place, I was very, very much affected by the landscape. And it's something I've always been interested in my films is there's a story and characters, but there's also the landscape that the film takes place in, which I love that. You know, it's one of the reasons why I love the mountains. One of the reasons I'm here now is because it gave me a chance to come back here. And so if you have something that you feel passionate about, I think that's enough to start with. Then you've got to figure out how to make the story engaging to other people. And try and stick with that kind of passion for the idea. And be different. I think that's the key thing, is to be, particularly at the beginning. As you go further and further along, as you become more experienced and budgets get higher and there's more pressure, it's harder and harder to be original. So at the beginning, I think you can take risks and gamble because nobody's expecting a huge box office hit. Right? You should just be trying to make a mark, if you can. Anyone else? Yeah.
Just going back to Senna, when Senna was released, I
did well in Ireland.
Yeah. When it was released, I thought it was a feature. Like, was it a conscious decision to sell it to lure the masses as a feature?
Yeah, absolutely. Because, like I said, if it was a niche, then we'd have one screen for one day somewhere. No, it kind of just crossed over in Ireland and in the UK and a few places. It just became. People just treated it like a movie, which is kind of what you want.
It's very much like, it looks like a blockbuster.
Yeah, totally. The poster, the trailer, I mean, the big thing about having a company like Universal behind it was that they spent money selling it. So I was talking to Ritu, you know, there were posters on the tube and there were posters everywhere and it was on the radio. It was like, it's unreal when you start, because I've made a few films and nobody even knew they came out, you know. You spend 5 years making a movie and it came out and people go, when's it coming out? You go, you know, it was out in the cinema. You know, I spoke to people after this. I did this film about the Olympics, which was organised by the people who ran the Olympics. And people in the film industry who were working in the cinema where the film was being shown didn't even know the film was on. They said, so I've really heard a lot of good things about your London film. When's it shown? It was in your cinema yesterday. Oh, right. And you just think, God, it's hard. That's the norm, okay? You spend all that time making something and people have no idea it's on. And they end up eventually seeing it maybe on DVD if you're lucky, if you can get a release, or if you literally go there and hand it out yourself. And what was nice about this was to make something that word of mouth became very positive. And that was a really interesting thing. If you are lucky enough to have something where you have, there's just something about this film which was that whenever we showed it, wherever in the world we showed it, however many people were in the cinema at the beginning, when the lights came on at the ending, there were always more. And normally my films is probably the opposite, okay? But no, if you're lucky, you have this situation where wherever we showed it, people just would somehow be drawn to the cinema and there'd be more people standing in the aisles. We showed it in Russia, it would happen. People were just filling up. And when you get that, and we knew that quite early on, when we were editing, we would show the film all the time to the executives to try to get them to understand what the film's going to be. And earlier on, when I was making films, I'd be very protective. I'd be very much like, no, it's not ready, I can't show it to you. Same with scripts, nobody is allowed to read it. Now I'm much more open. Now I'm like, I want to test it out with people. Okay, I don't mean test audiences, that's a different thing with cards and stuff. But with Senna, we wanted people to see it just to see if it was working, because we felt we had something that was working, but we needed everyone else to buy into it. So we repeatedly, every few weeks, would show it to the executives. Now normally what happens when you're dealing with studios is they watch the film once, they've seen it, they don't come again until the premiere, if you're lucky. In this case, we'd show the film, and by the way, my first cut of that was 7 hours. Then it was a very tight 5-hour cut, and we screened a 5-hour cut at the cinema, funny enough, and then a 4-hour cut, and then a 3-hour cut, and every time we showed it, everyone that came last to it would come again and again and again, and we just knew we had something that people would want to see the film again and again, and then they'd bring a friend with them, and generally it'd be people who have no interest in the sport. So very early on, by showing it, we realized there's a way, if we can get the word of mouth out there, then people who are not fans will go and see it, and it could cross over like any film. You just want your work to be treated like a movie, not as a documentary, but just a film. Oh, even though you don't like sport, it doesn't matter, come and see it. And the best way of doing that is word of mouth. The best way of doing that, to create word of mouth, is you've got to show the film and let the word spread. And that was the process we spent a long time doing. The interesting thing in the US is we had no release. Even though it was Universal, they had no interest in showing it in America because they thought there was no audience. So we ended up, myself and the producer took it to Sundance. And we showed it there, and because we had no release, we had no distribution, we had no PR person, we had no publicity person, we had nothing. So it was literally just myself and the producers were there, and then they flew back to a festival in Italy. So it was myself and the assistant editor. And all we had then was Twitter and Facebook. And we would just tell people on Twitter and Facebook the film was showing. And word by then had spread around the US for the kind of the hardcore Formula One fans. People started driving 1,000 miles to come and see the film because they thought it might be the only chance. People flew from Washington to Sundance, to Salt Lake City to see the film. And the word just started to spread, and every screening sold out. And like I said, if you go to Sundance, there's a huge kind of machinery of publicity and all of that. And we literally didn't have a penny to our name, so we were just wandering around saying, who's that? There's a big crowd, there's someone famous. You know, and weirdly enough, our film just created this buzz. And every screening sold out. And he ended up winning the audience prize. And that was a big moment for the people releasing the film around the world, that the film could win the audience prize, number one, at Sundance, but two, in a country where people don't know who he is and where they don't watch the sport. So then that's when they started to believe maybe there's a way that this film could break out of the niche kind of market. And what was interesting is in Ireland and in the UK, they held the release back a long time. So the film came out all over the world, and people were really pissed off that it hadn't come out at home. But it just created this desperation that people wanted to see the film because they'd heard lots of good things about it. And so when it did come out, they went to see it. And if they go to see it, the film stays on longer and longer at the cinema. And again, word of mouth spreads. And the critics were very positive. But also, it was on the radio, it was on TV, it was everywhere. And so we just managed to hit something. We got very lucky, very lucky. Anyone else? Yep.
During the process of filmmaking,
do you face some compromises? Do you have to go through some compromises? And how do you deal with them?
Good question. Really good question, yeah. Okay, so absolutely, you have to, because it's just the nature of the beast, okay? Things go wrong. I think it's important to try to be aware that's going to have to happen. So you need to know, it's a bit like I was saying, what's the reason why you want to make the film? What's the thing that you were desperate to cling on to? And what are the things that you would like, but you know, if you have to give and take us something, that's what I'm going to give. And in this case, I take Senna as an example. It makes much more sense when you see the film. Because of the way we've made the film, I didn't want to compromise on the overall kind of directing technique of not having contemporary talking heads. That was the one that I was going to fight to the end for. And it was a big fight. There were other things like how much information you give the audience, how much you tell in the voices and the voiceover, how many, you know, how long the film is, what scenes, some of the sequences have changed. I had 2 editors on the film. That's another interesting thing. One of the first cut of the film with the first editor was probably the art house version of the film. It was less explaining. There was less exposition, particularly at the beginning. And people who loved it really loved it, but it was probably a smaller audience. Then a second editor came on board that I worked with, who was much more, you've got to tell people, and that's not normally how I like to work. And what's interesting is the balance of the two really made the film what it is. And so I had a big row with him, I'll be honest, quite early on, where he put in talking heads, because he said this film's not working, you have to have talking heads. And while I was in Brazil doing interviews, he just changed the film. And I had to have a big row saying, well look, my name's on it, I'm the director, you're not the director. You're here to edit it. Okay? When we have to do interviews, they're not going to interview you, they're going to interview me. I'm going to have to stand in front of the audience. So if I've made a mistake, it's on my head, okay? But that's one thing I'm not going to compromise on. And it was quite kind of an awkward, passionate, emotional moment. Other things I'm going to go with, but that is the one thing where I'm just drawing a line. And he was like, fair enough, you're probably going to get fired, but okay. And that was the big gamble. You've got to be, if you really feel strongly about something, you've got to be willing to take it as far as you can, but knowing it could get you in trouble. Now, if it's your own film, that's fine. The other way of looking at it is, Senna is the most collaborative film I've ever made. It's the most successful film I've made, but it's also the most collaborative. And I know very much I was a hired director. Okay? It wasn't my idea. I didn't initiate it. I wasn't a producer on it. I didn't shoot it, most of it. You know, you look at it and you think, I had brilliant editors, I had a brilliant composer. We haven't talked about sound and music because that's a really big part of all filmmaking, and particularly at my films. I'm very much kind of interested in how sound and music works. There was a writer, there was a producer, there were editors, there were researchers, and I'm just one of a team. And that's really important. I don't like having a film by on my films. I have had it in the past, I wouldn't do it again really. I'm just one of a team. I've directed it, but I haven't done everything else. And so I think the idea of letting people, I hire people that are brilliant at what they do, and then I listen to them. And then I let them do their job. I don't tell them what to do. I'm like, you come, first of all, you tell me what you would do. Okay, whatever department. The editor, you do the first cut. Composer, come up with the music that you feel would be right. I'm not going to tell, I'm not a musician, you're the brilliant musician. In the case of The Warrior, going back to The Warrior, my composer on that was this guy called Dario Marinelli, an Italian guy. And Dario had never been to India. And he'd done my student film, The Sheep Thief. And he's a brilliant composer. So I said, look, what I want to do is I want to bring you out to location. I want you to come to India, and then you'll understand what India's about. And maybe then you'll come up with music which is more interesting than if you just write it from North London. So he came to location. He'd never been on location before. And the theme for the film came to him while we were doing a night shoot one day in Rajasthan. And then he used local musicians to he didn't speak their language, they didn't speak his language, but they understood music. And he got the musicians to create the music, which he took away and edited in London. On Senna, I wasn't allowed to show anyone the film because we didn't own the footage. But the composer who did the film, Dario, by the way, won an Oscar for Atonement, and he did Pride and Prejudice. He's become a huge composer, Dario. But the first time he went on location was on our film. Now he always asks to do that on every film because he wants to feel the place. The guy that did Senna, Antonio Pinto, he did City of God, Central Station, he did Collateral. He's a big, big composer from Sao Paulo, from Brazil. And the funny thing on Senna was, Senna's the only film that I've done where people ring us up saying, I hear you're making a film about Senna, how can we help? He rang us up and saying, I want to do the music, I'm a huge fan. People ring us up saying, we've owned Senna's racing cars, do you want them? I'm like, no, we're doing a documentary. You know, people would just want to give us stuff because they love him so much. So with Antonio, I said, look, I can't show you the film. I would like you to do the film. I can't afford to come to Brazil. I can't bring you to London. We don't have the budget. But can you write the music anyway? before you've seen the film, will you write the music? And then I can edit it with that music, and then people will fall in love with it, and they'll hire you. And that's always my technique, is get people, if you can get them to do some of the work, it becomes like the thing that has to be there, and then they'll work it out. So that's what Antonio did. The main themes in the film were written before he saw any of the film, purely from his memories of Ayrton Senna, and that becomes the main emotional theme of the film, is his music written before he saw anything. So that, in terms of compromises, there were times when the editor wanted to lose some of the music, and the second editor wanted to change the pacing, because he felt it was too slow. And the danger is, you make a film about a racing driver, he shouldn't be really slow, should it, the film? So he was really good at pacing. He was really good at pacing, and he took 15 minutes out of the film, which I really miss. I wish the film could be longer, but I do now, I'm very much aware that if it were not for that second editor, the film would not have been as successful as it is. So it was interesting to have this balance of one person who did the emotion and another person who was really good with music and with pacing. And without each of them, the film would never be the film it is, you know. So figure out where your battles are and choose your battles carefully. Don't just fight for the sake of it over everything because you think you're a director, that's what you're meant to do. I don't think that necessarily helps. I think it should be listen to people, because you may be wrong. And better people tell you you've made a mistake before you finish the film rather than afterwards. And say, none of us like that idea, but we didn't know, you know, you're the director. I want the opposite. I want my crew and my friends, when they're seeing something, if I'm doing something wrong, tell me. You know, and I might not agree, but there'll be a few times when I go, do you know what? I just didn't see it. I missed it. I totally missed it. And so I want people that feel like they can be open with me. Anyone else? Yep, at the back.
Yeah, I'm actually a fiction writer. So basically, like a fiction writer, a character's journey is usually, you have those romantic elements, and there's a character graph, and there's growth, you know. So in a documentary, how do you actually potentially capture those romantic moments? Is it based on the research? Is it based on the kind of footage shot, or is the editing more?
Yeah, I think it's all of the above. It depends on the subject, because hopefully there's whatever the subject is, whatever the story, hopefully some drama in it, and so you're making it because this thing here is interesting. So then, for me, I'm still, you know, I'm more experienced with fiction than I'm with documentary, but for me, it's using the classic rules of drama when working out the story on a, you know, you still have that beginning, middle, and end. Not necessarily in that order, but you've got those elements, and you're thinking about, this is where we start, this is where we're going, this is where we're going to pay off. And so what I like about the documentary way of working is I don't necessarily start with a script. There will be a script. There'll be a document somewhere down the line. There'll be a piece of paper that tells you what the key beats are and the journey, but I like to just go up and shoot something and start cutting it. So I particularly like editing, and I think getting on with the editing process is the writing often. You know, when any film you make, you're going to write 3 times. You're going to write it, you're going to shoot it, you're going to cut it. And again, you don't have to do them in that order. You might start cutting, then shooting, then writing. And so with the docs that I've been involved in, often it's editing, then writing, then shooting, and they all happen at the same time. And so what it means is you get much more time to cut, and you get much more time to work on a story. And with drama, because you're doing it over, you know, average time it takes to make a feature film is about 7 years. And so, you know, you have 2 years maybe of writing a script or getting it developed. You have another year of maybe shooting, and then you have another time where you're editing, and you have the time it gets to release the film. Before you know it, it's 4 or 5 years of your life. So documentaries don't have to take so long, but the guys I was talking to yesterday, some people have been making a film for 20 years, you know, because they're following a certain person or certain people every 7 years or every 3 years. So it's even a longer scale. So all the time I think you're going away, you're cutting and then reshooting and cutting and shooting. And I personally, I really like that process of doing everything at the same time. Yeah.
Would you set some kind of rules before start shooting a documentary, or would you just shoot and after that do the edition?
I think it's worth knowing what you want to try and say, I guess. Because the thing with fiction is you can always reshoot. Okay, you can always go back. Now, I suppose with documentary there may be something happening that's only going to happen once, and you don't have time to plan it. You should just get out there and shoot it, just in case that incident, wherever it may be, never happens. Has any of you seen the Iranian film The Apple? Have you seen that? This is a great film which is about this filmmaker, I think. His a very famous filmmaker, and his daughter made the film, Samira. It's about these two girls that had never left home. The parents had kept them locked up. And somebody heard about it, and I think they were 13 or something like that. They were quite old, and they'd had younger, 9, 10. They never met children, they never played, they'd been locked up. It's a real story. And somebody heard about it, and the parents were in court. And the judge said, for you to understand what it's like, I'm going to lock you up. And the filmmakers heard about this and ran to the court with the video camera that they had nearby and just shot it. So the opening of the film is on one format. And then they managed to get the two girls, and what it looks like to me is it's the real thing, where the girls go for a walk around their village for the first time. And it's literally like they've never ever been out of their house. They can't speak. They can't communicate. They've never played with children. They don't know what anything is in the world. It's like they've been, and the filmmakers capture it. It's a fiction film, but you can see everything that's happening is real. You're like, how the hell have they got these performances? There are actors that pop up in the middle of the story. There's a beautiful young girl that was in an earlier film by the filmmaker, and she comes in and interacts with them. And there's all these little scenes where the filmmakers set things up, but it's all done in a kind of documentary style. And what they obviously did there, the opening was, something's happening now, just go and shoot it. And then once you've got that, then think about what am I going to do with it. And I think that's the way I would say is, if there's an incident that's happening, don't spend so long thinking about it and worrying, just get out there, shoot it, and then see how I'm going to use it. And then plan what to do, I would say. Yep.
I want to take it a step back. You talked about how long it takes to develop a script. You said that it takes a long time. I met a filmmaker who's done novel writing and he's done screenwriting, and he said, my best advice to you would be, forget writing the script, write a book.
Yeah.
It's easier to make a book into a film.
It's true.
What's your advice?
Yeah, no, look, the truth is, most of the screenwriters that I know, everybody starts off writing original screenplays. And then there's a point when nobody wants to make an original screenplay, because people who make the decisions look at it going, I don't know if it's good or not. People generally don't read, okay? They've got a pile of scripts and they just don't have the attention span. They'll get an assistant to read it saying, what's the story? Oh, I'm not interested. And then they see a book that's been published. They go, it must be good because it's been published, right? And it's all there. And it's got reviews telling me what to think. And so if you look at most films that are made, they're remakes or they're books or they're classics or, and that's the truth. The executives don't necessarily always know, so they're going to pick something that someone else has published, and they're going to say, well, it's been a bestseller. We've got a franchise because that author's written 3 or 4 books, The Hunger Games or Harry Potter, and that's really what the big money people are looking for, a franchise, okay? They're not looking for a really original film like A Separation, the Iranian film of, although that may get remade, they might remake a film, but it's true that the reality is if you want to be a screenwriter, I think directors at the beginning have to write, okay? Because no one's going to give you a script. If you haven't made anything, no one's going to be throwing screenplays at you. So you have to write your own scripts. And I think that goes back to what we were talking about earlier about, then I would say try to be as original as possible. But I think if you are a screenwriter, unless you've found someone to collaborate with, it's really hard to get them made. So yeah, it's not a bad idea to write novels as well, I would say. Write short stories, write screenplays, because all it needs is for your one book or one thing to become a hit, and they're going to want to know what else you've got. And Tarantino had how many scripts lying around until he made one, then everybody wanted to make everything else that he's done. So it's not bad to have them. Yeah.
I was wondering with documentary filmmaking, if you could speak to about sort of the ethics of representation. How do you decide what the most salient feature of a person is and what you're going to represent, and then how do they feel about that?
It's a really good question, and it's a really tricky one because there's more people that have come in. How many people, hands up, who's seen Senna here? See, this is the problem. I could tell you about, is anybody likely to come and see it tomorrow? So what do? Do I show you the ending or not? You tell me. This is a problem, see? Because it's most relevant to this film. There is a particular sequence in the film which I'm trying to figure out, how can I talk about it without talking about it? Look, because I'm not an investigative reporter, okay, I come from a fiction background, I wanted to make this film, I was asked to direct it. The documentaries I made, I'm not trying to be one of those guys that's going to try and say, I'm going to reveal how corrupt you are or something like that. In this particular case, I'm a bit of a fan of this guy. So I was telling his story, and there's a particular point in the film where we wanted to tell a story, and I realized that I was dealing with footage that I've never had to deal with on a fiction film. Okay, in a fiction film, it's all constructed, okay? They're all pretending, aren't they? and you can get them to do it again, and it's not real blood, and you know, it's not a real gun, and all that sort of stuff. And in this film, there was a moment when I was cutting this stuff together, and I just had to stop, because I just thought, ethically and morally, I've never been in that situation before, and I don't really know how to deal with it. I don't really know, because what I'm trying to do as a filmmaker is make this sequence as emotional as possible, but also, am I manipulating people? Am I manipulating the people in the film? We had their permission, which is awkward because, you know, to make a film about Senna, you need to get permission, because everybody wanted to make a film about him previously, and nobody had permission to make a film about him. So we had permission, but then you've got this pressure of saying, well, I don't want to make this film which is just kind of on one side, but also I don't want to try and make people feel awful. And it was a really interesting issue, and I ended up stopping. I just thought, I'm not going to work anymore today, I'm going to go off and I'm going to watch a movie. And the London Film Festival was on at the time, and there was this film which was the opening movie about a famous poet made by a very, very well-known, brilliant filmmaker, and at the end of that film, the artist died. And everybody was in the film throwing themselves around and being really emotional. I remember sitting going, I don't believe any of this. You know, I remember thinking, this all looks fake to me. This all looks so over the top. It's so over-dramatized and over-emotional and manipulative. And it was a moment where I thought, okay, when I next make a fiction film, I think making a documentary may well affect how I shoot the fiction film. Because I think there are certain things you feel you're supposed to do in drama, because that's how people... And I remember thinking, I don't believe it. And a lot of dramas that I see now, I just don't believe them. And I spent a long time looking at real people and studying them and living with them, and you know when they're lying, you know when they're telling the truth, and you are able to play with that footage in a certain way. And it was really interesting how it's changed my feeling on fiction. I'm kind of not answering your question for an obvious reason, but I can, if you come to the screening, we can talk about this after the film. Because I think that's the best way to explain it, is after the film I'll talk to you about specific scenes and why they were done a certain way. And it's also when what you don't want to do is hold back from showing things, because you've got to be honest, okay? If there is something that has happened, you've got to show it, but how do you show it in such a way that you're not manipulating the audience? And that's the challenge. And until you do it and until you put it out there, you never know if you've got it right or wrong. That's the risk, I suppose, you have to be willing to take. Anyone else? Did anyone else have a question? We've been going for a while. I don't know if... I'm quite happy to talk if you have anything you want to listen to, but do you have any other questions? Yeah. And then Ritu...
What are the other documentaries that are your favorites?
My references for this, the films that I really loved, there's two sporting docs that I really loved. One was When We Were Kings, which is about Muhammad Ali. Have you ever seen, anyone seen that? Oh, it's a great film. Right, that's the film that I saw at the Empire Leicester Square in London, one of the biggest cinemas. And the music was amazing, and it was just this big movie, right, with his proper presence. This guy was cinema. Muhammad Ali in his prime. It's also very moving, because if you know what he's like now, and if you know what he's like a few years ago, he just makes you cry. And that was the thing, that I cried a lot watching that film. But at the time, I just loved it, okay? The other film is Hoop Dreams by Steve James, which is about these two... He's an American filmmaker from Chicago who makes quite political films. His film last year was The Interrupters. If you get a chance to see The Interrupters, it's amazing, about gun violence in Chicago. But Hoop Dreams was a film that he spent 7 or 8 years following a couple of kids, a couple of 7-year-olds from Chicago, from the projects, 2 poor black kids who want to play basketball, who want to make it to the NBA. And he just follows them. And the film's this epic journey of at one point one of them's up and one of them's down and one of them's up and something goes wrong. And basically, these kids have got all the pressure of their entire family on their shoulders. Because if they make it to the NBA, they're going to be millionaires. But if they don't make it, you know, it's going to be very tough. And the family have no other hope apart from these kids. And part of the thing about they're brilliant basketball players, but a big part of it is nature. To be an NBA player, you've got to be 6 foot something tall. So not only have they got this thing of how talented they are and getting through college and getting the, you know, making it, but it's also like they're not growing. And there's nothing they can do about it. If they're not growing enough, they're never going to get picked up. And it's an amazing film. And I saw it way back in '94. And I just remember it was a proper epic, following these kids and this journey. But it's very political. So if you get a chance to see Hoop Dreams, you should. His last film, The Interrupters, is amazing because that was about gun violence and the number of people, kids particularly, that are killed in Chicago through guns. And, you know, of course, this whole thing in America that you've got to have the right to bear arms, okay? So what happens is there's people who used to be in gangs in Chicago who decided to form a group called the Interrupters, who are anti-violence, who are anti-gun violence. So whenever they hear of a fight, somebody will call up and they'll go into the middle of a fight and try and stop it and calm it down. And it's an amazing film. And the lead character is a black Muslim woman who wears a headscarf. Is Amina, who's got the most sweet, pretty little face. But she is like Malcolm X or someone when she talks. She's incredible. And she will intellectually talk everyone down from the kind of violence that they're about to do. It's great. She is a movie star, right? For me, that's what you want. So if you get a chance to see The Uninterrupted, the long version, his films are quite long. And when they showed it in England, they cut an hour out of it. It's a bit like when they show Hindi films in England. They take all the songs out. Well, here they took out half the film, you know, and it wasn't half as good when it came out on release. So they're the two off the top of my head. But you should see The Imposter if you get a chance. It's a fantastic film, which is one film. Anyone else, or shall we? You had enough?